Today I'm going to be explaining supply and demand, the main factors that affect them, followed by real-world examples in oil sector. First off, supply and demand is the root of all economics. It's the base and it's where most of economics is developed upon. So let's get started. Relationship, or in other words, the direct relationship between the price of a certain good and how much a firm is willing to and able to produce at different prices is the law of supply. Price of a certain good goes up. Firms or companies would want to make more of the product, but if the prices go down, the firms wouldn't want to make so much of it because they don't get much out of it. Why? Because firms would want to produce more of something if it sells for higher because they get more revenue. But if it sells for less, they wouldn't want to make so much. That's why the supply curve is sloped outwards. The supply curve is normally faced outwards because producers make more revenue at a higher price that their good is sold on and less revenue when the good is sold for less. The supply curve and the demand curve work differently from one another. The supply curve is based on how much a producer makes of a certain product at different prices. As you can see when on P1, meaning the good is sold for less, the quantity that's supplied is not so great. But when the price moves from P1 to P2, meaning the good is sold for a higher price, suddenly the quantity that's supplied is much higher than when on P1. Therefore, it's causing the slope to face outwards because the higher the price, the higher the quantity the producer would want to produce. Briefly go through factors that affect supply. If the cost of production increases on making a product, the company or firm wouldn't want to make more of that product because it costs more for them. Therefore, they get less profit or revenue. If the government intervenes with the supply, therefore they ask for direct tax or indirect tax. Direct tax affects demand, indirect tax affects supply, meaning the supply curve moves to the left. If the government asks for tax on either of the capital, labor or land or applies it on them, therefore the firm has to pay more taxes. Therefore, the cost of production increases, so they don't supply that much of the certain product. On to demand. In simple words, demand is the amount of a good a consumer wants to buy at a given price in a certain amount of time backed by the ability to pay. The demand curve is sloped inwards because then that means the consumer will out of instinct buy more of a product if it's cheaper. There's a relationship between the price and the quantity demanded. Therefore, when the price goes up, the quantity demanded goes down. Makes sense, right? Because you would buy less of something at a higher price. On the other hand, when the price goes down, the quantity demanded goes up because you would buy more of something if it's at a lower price. As explained, the inverse relationship between the price and the quantity demanded is the law of demand. This is why it's inward sloping, because a higher price means lower demand. This is the demand curve. As you can see on the y-axis, there are given prices, P3 being the lowest and P1 being the highest. And on the x-axis is the quantity demanded at those different prices. This is the lowest and this is the highest. Looking at this graph, it's easily seen that at a lower price, when the price is at P3, the quantity demanded is much greater, meaning at lower prices, us as the consumers are willing to buy more. And on the other hand, when the price is P1, meaning a higher price, the quantity demanded is much lower because a higher price means less quantity demanded most of the time. Here are a few factors that affect the quantity demanded other than price. In a brief understanding of these factors, let's take consumer incomes for instance. The consumer incomes affect demand because the higher the income of consumers or buyers, in other words, the more they'll be willing to spend. If the weather is rainy or sunny or anything, for instance, you would buy clothes and stuff according to the environment. In the majority of the time, consumers will be buying according to the trends, therefore more demand of a certain good. All of these factors cause the demand curve to shift either to the left or to the right, but when the price comes into consideration, it causes change only along the curve. We know the basics of supply and demand. Let's apply that knowledge into a real-world market such as the oil sector. As you can see in this table, on the left side are all the key factors that affect supply. On the right side are some of the key factors that affect demand in the oil market. In the middle are some of the factors that affect both of them in some way. Let's take inventories for example, or in other words, stock. It's one of the key features that influence oil prices in the market, and this is how it impacts it positively or negatively. Number one, if few of the major oil-consuming countries decide to drop their domestic inventories like Saudi Arabia, it would mean the stock in their country would impact oil demand negatively and vice versa, because it means there's less demand in the market, and this will change the market into a buyer's market. Now, I'll briefly describe and further explain some of the factors that affect supply or demand. Let's take weather for instance. As you can see, it affects both supply and demand. For example, when winter begins, demand of heating increases in European countries because of the cold weather, which results in high consumption of oil to fuel their heating system. This creates a supply and demand imbalance. This is because it results in higher oil prices due to excess demand, because many people demand heating, but the supply remains the same. It remains constant. You would probably think during a geopolitical situation like war or embargoes, you'd probably think that demand will decrease, but really the opposite happens. Because during these times, countries start building their domestic inventories, or in other words, stock, to get ready for any supply crisis which may be caused by reduced supply or an increase in demand due to the war being in between oil producing countries, or maybe if there's even the slightest possibility of the war spreading to other countries. We've seen this during the oil embargo period and Iran, Iraq and the Gulf War. As you can see in this graph, and that at the announcement of the oil embargo between Saudi Arabia and America in 1973, the price of oil per barrel was just $15, and then in just 1 year in 1974, the price of oil per barrel reached $45 per barrel. This is because the demand increased while the supply remained constant. Another event that impacted the prices of oil due to excess demand was the Iran-Iraq war in 1978. The oil prices were just $35 a barrel, and in just 3 years it was touching $74 a barrel. And other similar events can be seen in this graph. Demand is heavily impacted during any recession or by economic growth. Taking recession into consideration, the buying power of the consumers is affected because of lower incomes or either no source of income at all. This results in a demand drop because people can't afford to buy goods, and then this further results into a drop in prices. As evident in this graph, you can see during the recession period, you can see the oil prices are affected heavily because of the drop of demand and excess supply. And finally, economic growth. With a growing economy like China or India, the demand of oil to fuel their economy increases. This is firstly due to a higher income from consumers and a higher overall energy demand domestically.